So you learn any more about
Yep, you're live. Why that is.
So you're going off of that camera?
Well, I wanted to go off this one, but I'm not sure how to get there. Well, we don't have time to mess with it now, but it's live. Would you give thanks for the bread this morning?
It's good to see everyone here this morning. As we begin our class, Brian, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for allowing us to be able to come here this morning to learn more about your word. Be with the teachers this morning, that the things that they might teach might be taught according to your will. Be with us as students, that the things that we might learn, we might be able to take out and teach others out in the world. Forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So in the past, I don't know how many weeks we've been studying these letters to the seven churches in Asia, and we talked in our opening classes when we first started studying the book of Revelation how it's a book of that's just filled with all kinds of symbology and different references to other things, very figurative type things. And we looked at some examples of that early on, but then we got into these letters where there's a lot of really straightforward instruction to these different churches. And even then, we spent a lot of time looking at how all the ways that Jesus described himself, a lot of the analogies that he used, especially in this last church in Laodicea. We looked at a lot of the way the symbols that he used, the analogies that he used to help them see where they had gone wrong, and to really help explain these things to them. But now as we're getting into chapter 4, chapter 5, this is much more representative of what Revelation as a whole is like, as far as the language that is used, as far as the kind of messaging that it has, and how we should best read it and interpret these things. Chapters 4 and 5 are kind of a good start for us into that. What was the purpose of Revelation, of the book? You may remember this is many, many months ago, before we talked about the churches, before we looked at all those letters. Jerry?
Chastisement.
Is a chastisement? Okay, how so?
Because they were doing wrong, but they couldn't see it beyond their minds. They didn't know they were doing wrong.
Okay, so some of the letters, the purpose was to correct them, to chastise them in certain ways. Okay, what about the book as the Revelation as a whole, even outside the letters? Carl,
No, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ that he gave to John to reveal some things that would shortly come to pass.
right?
When we got into those letters.
Yeah.
That's what we had at the beginning of the book.
hmm
Some things that shortly come to pass.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Robbie, is that what you were
Yeah,
going
in
to say?
verse 3, it says, in connection with that, there were words of that they needed to keep and to hear and to understand because of this event that was coming
Yeah.
in their lifetime.
Right, and we even saw that the letters to the churches, the 7 letters to those churches that we just spent time studying, oftentimes had specific reference where Jesus was trying to prepare them for these things that were going to take place. In some cases, he says, if you do these things, you'll be guarded for when when the tribulation comes. Other times, it was more on the negative side that if these churches didn't correct themselves, that they would that they weren't going to be able to stand in that day either. And so, even the letters themselves kind of have a reference to this purpose, where Christians needed to be prepared in order to go through these times that were about to come on the world at that time. And right, we look at passages like, just going back to like Carl mentioned, Revelation 1:1 is very upfront about kind of the main purpose of this, which was that it was a revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. And he made known by sending his angel to his servant John. So John is receiving these visions that are that the Christians of this time needed to hear. And of course, there's still things that we can, that the very things that he was trying to make clear to them aren't things that we're going to experience, but they're things we could look back on now, and it can build our faith because we see how this was all part of God's plan, all the things that were about to happen to Christians, to Jews, to all these people living at this time. And so as we get into chapters 4 and 5 here, I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that the things that we're about to read about aren't there. The purpose of them isn't to help us build in our head a picture of what heaven is going to be like, right? It's not there to help us build this accurate picture of exactly what's going to be happening in heaven for all time. It's not there to help us understand the setup of heaven in any way, although oftentimes it's phrased in that way, and there may be things that are there that are carried over, but that's not the purpose of the things that we're reading about. They're to teach these certain lessons and to enlighten them on things that are going to be taking place at that time for them. And we have some of this imagery in heaven because oftentimes these deal with spiritual things. And God's throne is in heaven, God is in heaven, and that's where that's where all things come from. It's a setting of many visions that deal with spiritual things, even going all the way back to the Old Testament. We're gonna look at that as well a little bit. So the focus that we're going to be looking at is on the spiritual state of things, not so much what's actually going on. And I think if that's kind of been the biggest thing for me in studying this, right, is, sometimes when we just flip to Revelation and we read a few verses out of the middle of it somewhere, and we see these visions of all these things, and we're like, wow, how does that even fit in? Is this what we have to look forward to when we go there? Is that what things are going to look like or be like, or the kind of the different creatures that we see, all that kind of stuff? And I think that's kind of where we lose track of. And it's very easy to do because we read things and we want to kind of picture them literally and have some kind of literal interpretation for them. But I think keeping in mind the type of book this is, the type of writing that's used, and its context and within the Bible and what its purpose is, it helps us to stay focused on what these visions mean, rather than trying to interpret them in some literal way, which I think oftentimes can lead us away from the purpose of the book. Because that's not what the purpose is, just about all the time when we're looking at those things. So So in kind of a broad sense, before we start getting into just a couple of the verses here in chapter 4, we're going to be looking at chapters 4 and 5. And from my best understanding of this, we kind of see, even though John is being told these are things, he's going to show, he's about to be shown things in chapter 4. In chapter 4, verse 1, John is told that, come up here and I will show you what must take place after this. Right? That kind of language, it's not just referring to these two specific chapters here. That's referring to basically the rest of the visions that he's going to be having, and the things that are going to be revealed to him ultimately deal with things that are coming soon, just like verse 1 told us in chapter 1, verse 1. But in setting the stage for this, and setting the stage for what he's about to see, I think we're going to find that chapter 4 is kind of dealing with this scene in heaven in Old Testament times, a vision of an Old Testament throne scene, and certain lessons that are brought out of that. And then chapter 5 transitions us to the New Testament throne scene. And we're going to see a very important event that transpires kind of in the transition between these two chapters that we probably won't get into much today, but I think is going to be a really good thing for us to study. It's one of the most interesting things that I found, which is, even after John is shown this vision in chapter 4, and it seems like very good things, right? That God is being praised, that these elders are bowing down and worshiping before him. The creatures are worshiping him. All these things that we'll be looking at. What's John's reaction to that? How does John react in that kind of space between 4 and 5? Well, as we're going to see, he weeps. He cries that there's something that's missing from there that he sees. And I think it's going to be really interesting as we get into that to really look at that and understand that. I think that's kind of the key to understanding these two chapters as a whole, and then of course even further on in Revelation. So let's go ahead and begin just to kind of get a feel for this whole chapter. Let's just read verses 1 through 11. Then I'd like us to go back and we'll get through maybe 2 or 3 of these verses here and kind of looking at more of the specifics. But to begin, let's read verses 1 through 11. Michelle, could you read that for us?
After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper, and a sardius stone in appearance. There was a rainbow around the throne, in appearance like a sun. Around the throne were 24 thrones. On the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the thrones proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in the front and in the back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature was like a calf, the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him, who sits on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created.
Okay, we have quite the picture painted for us here, don't we? And just filled with all kinds of imagery used to describe what John is seeing in this vision. And there's symbols that we'll discuss that are just all throughout here, everything from these 24 thrones and 24 elders on those thrones to the appearance of God being like jasper and carnelian, and an emerald rainbow around him, describing what it is to look at that picture. We read about white garments and gold crowns, lightning, rumbling, peals of thunder. We read about these 7 torches of fire, representing the 7 spirits of God, as it mentions there in the passage. A sea of glass that's like crystal. We read about these 4 living creatures, which are kind of some of the imagery that really sticks in my head when you first read this, doesn't it? Where it's that are on the front, the back, the left and right of God, that are all around him on these 4 sides. They're full of eyes. They have 6 wings each. One of them looks like a lion. One of them looks like an ox. One has a face of a man. One is an eagle in flight. All these different things that have significance, that we can that have certain things that they represent, that I think all fit together really well when you once we dig into these things and kind of figure out what's going on in this passage. And when we first get into these verses here in Revelation 4, we kind of see this similar language being used into how John is having this vision. Where we see in kind of the transition between verses 1 and 2 there, where this voice which he heard, which is like it's the voice that he heard before, where he was calling to him to view these things, and that same voice says, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." And at once I was in the Spirit. And we remember from back in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, when we go over there, 1 verse 10 said that John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, 'Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches.'" So just as John was receiving those things, and it describes him as being in the Spirit, that he was, he wasn't taken away in his flesh and blood, his body up somewhere to see something. He was either taken in a vision in his mind or transformed in some way to go view these things with this angel. And he goes up there and is shown this throne room of God, this vision of heaven. And is this the first time that somebody has been kind of shown this kind of scene, this kind of setting, seeing where God sits?
Isaiah 6, 1-6.
Yeah.
Very similar.
Let's go ahead and turn there, because it's not only do we find the same kind of scene being unfolded, but we even find some of the same kind of imagery, both in this place and in others that we'll look at in just a moment. But let's turn to Isaiah 6. And Grubby, could you read those verses 1-6?
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. How far did you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. Yeah,
And this is definitely a description of God, the Almighty. He describes him here as the Lord of hosts, Jehovah.
Mhm.
That's who he's talking about.
Yeah, and this picture of him, and of course this Isaiah here is in awe when he sees this, thinking that he's observing God here, and even in this vision, God being represented here by this how does it describe him? It talks about that his voice kind of trembling the foundations, that the whole place was filled with smoke. It says that his train filled the temple. What does that mean? What is the train? It's not what we think of as a train today. Well, it wasn't riding along on a train. It's like the edges of his garment, of his robe. So it's kind of like giving to us a picture just of the size of it, the grandeur of it. And we also saw the kind of similar imagery in this with these creatures that had 6 wings, again, kind of similar to what we're reading here in Revelation. But a very similar scene kind of being set to the one we're reading in our main text. And again, these things being representative of other things, even the way God is portrayed here in these, it's giving us a picture of how magnificent it is. Not necessarily exactly what God looks like. I don't know if that could be explained in words in a way that would accurately describe that. And that's also not the purpose of this. The purpose of it is for these different attributes to bring glory and like magnificence to who God is, and to through what we understand, which is the appearance of things, and oftentimes even going beyond that to even the things that are used to describe him back in our main text can have representations as well. Like, what are the 2 stones that it uses to describe what God, what the radiance of God was like in our main text back in Revelation? Look there in verse 3. What does it say? Okay, jasper and sardine, jasper and what is it? Carnelian, just maybe another word for the same kind of stone. And when, depending on your translation, when you look back in other places, I had a reference of this. Give me 1 second here. I think I may have forgot to include this verse, but there's a verse in describing kind of the breastplate that Aaron, the priest in the Old Testament, wore. And the first and last stones that he had, I think he had 12 stones in his like precious stones in that breastplate that he wore, were these same 2 that we read about here. It was the first and last one. Well, it can, you think about that God has described himself as the first and the last, the beginning and the end of all things. And so we see these different kind of representations here, even with the rainbow that shone around him. Of course, in part, I think that's just talking about the radiance of him and how beautiful it is. Because we look at a rainbow, and oftentimes it's awesome. It's something that brings us awe, and it's something that's beautiful. And but a rainbow, we know, through God himself, also represents a covenant that he made with man. And knowing that that's part of his character in keeping his promises and his covenants. All these things can have significances like that as well, that helps us understand not just what it looks like, but what it means to behold God, and the kind of things that would bring to mind for us. Carl?
In this first chapter 4 here, they're painting a picture that we as humans can see all of these beautiful things, and God's in the middle. But what it boils down to, the elders with the crowns, the animals, and everything, everybody is paying homage to the Father. That's the whole chapter.
Mm-hmm.
All the animals, the elders, everybody is honoring the Father. But as you said, this picture they're painting, we can comprehend a beautiful stone and crystal and all that kind of stuff. But whether it's literal, that's something else. But we can picture something real beautiful. And that's our Father. And all the other elements, everybody is worshiping the Father. So how great the Father is, that's brought out in this whole chapter.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that a lot of the ways that are being used to describe him are the very things that he created. These are created things. These weren't things that he was before, and that he just like the Jaspers are actually put here because they're like a piece of God or something. No, he's using these beautiful things that are just created things that are beautiful, that are in his creation, the rainbow, these different precious stones, which are physical things that we have here that we can look at, that we can use to kind of build this picture, to understand it in certain ways, in certain senses. What sense does he shine like a rainbow or like these precious stones? And he's using created things to kind of describe something that isn't created, something that trying to get us to see the attributes of something. And right, like Carl was pointing out with that all these things that we read about are performing actions. So we read about these four creatures to the sides, and we'll probably get into future classes. I don't want to get too deep into it now, but these things that seem to be alive and there aren't always there. Oftentimes it's not. You have living things that might represent things that aren't like creatures. It's not necessarily representing a person or any kind of ruler or king or a different set of people. The creatures could be certain attributes of God that bring praise to him. We know that God's creation can praise him, right? We know that just the things that he's created in this world, the world itself, can bring glory to God. We know that his attributes, right? We read about like that one creature being like a lion. We know that God can be like a lion in many ways, where he brings that respect and that fear, just like animals would for a lion, like we would have for a lion if standing face to face with him. And same thing with an eagle can represent other attributes of God, that he's far above everything else, that he's able to see things that we might not be able to see. And we see that those four creatures worship God, and then the other things follow him. So when you go back through the Old Testament and we look at how God's actions brought glory to him, right? Whether he was there fighting for Israel, whether he was working some wonderful sign, whether he was showing his might and bringing fear upon his people through his judgment, through his chastisement, all those things were bringing glory to God. Which then, when we read about those now, when other people read about those, when the people of that time saw those, then they would worship God. And so you see this order of things happening, where first those creatures worship him, then you see the 24 elders worshiping. And it's these kind of scenes that I think are built to kind of show us help us understand what was going on in Old Testament times. Specifically in this chapter. And so I'd also like us to turn over to Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel chapter 1. And I want to read about this vision that was being had here because of, again, some of the similarities that we read about that we see with Revelation. So let's read verses 26 and 28 in Ezekiel chapter 1. Sean, can you read those for us?
26 through 28?
Yeah, 26 through 28.
And above the firmament over their heads was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like a sapphire stone. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of a man high above it. Also from the appearance of his waist and upward I saw, as it were, the color of amber, with the appearance of fire all around without it, or within it. And from the appearance of his waist and downward I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire with brightness all around. like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking.
Okay. So some similar imagery, but also some things that are different, right? But if we understand these in the right way, where these different things are emphasizing different attributes of God, of what he is seeing, and they would mean different things. Just because fire is missing in the passage that we're reading in Revelation doesn't mean that it's conflicting with this. Even if other stones were mentioned, they could be mentioned for different reasons, or they could be they could be describing things that in certain ways for certain reasons. But we find a lot of similarities here, don't we? We read that just that it was a bright, gleaming sight. That we read about stones being used to, the appearance like sapphire, right? Very, very radiant, very bright, and beautiful. Verse 28, we find that kind of we find the rainbow analogy being used again here. That rainbow sign, where he says it was like the appearance of a bow that's in the cloud on the day of rain. And so was the appearance of the brightness all around, right? So describing the radiance of that. And his reaction, again, we see him similar to what we read in Isaiah. What was his reaction? To fall on his face, to be awestruck, to be humbled by what he was seeing, and by what he was hearing in this case as well. And just one more that I wanted to look at would be found in Daniel chapter 7. And we've talked before about how similar Daniel and Revelation are. I know in the first chapter or two of our studies that we really reference Daniel a lot, and kind of seeing the similarities, seeing a lot of there were a lot of lessons to be learned by comparing these two books. And in Daniel chapter 7, let's read verses 9 through 14. And Chris, can you read those for us?
Daniel 7:9-14. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from behind before him. 1,000 ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the votes were open. I watched them because of the sound of the pompous words which the whole was speaking. I watched for the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time. I was watching the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom of one, which shall not be destroyed.
All right. So again, lots of very similar language being used here, even to the point of this vision and how it kind of culminated with in verse 13 there, with the Son of Man coming and coming before the Ancient of Days, coming before the God the Father, and was presented before him, and again, kind of described in different ways than we're going to see in Revelation. But how the end result is the same, where then he was given dominion. He was given this kingdom. And this, of course, referring to Christ here. But we go back and we look at the description of God given here, and it, you may have heard Chris emphasizing that his appearance, it was like this and like that. It was like pure wool was the hair. What was the other one? Had like pure wool, and we saw also back in Ezekiel where the brightness around him was like the appearance of a bow. These are things that they're just being used to help build this picture in our head. And whereas the reality of it may be something totally different, but these help us to view certain attributes of what we're reading of God, of Jesus in some of this, and just of this scene that's around him, and spiritually kind of what's going on, which we're going to be getting into in more detail in a little while. Robbie?
Yeah, did you have 1 Timothy 6 down as a reference?
I don't think I did for this class. No, it's
1 Timothy 6, 14 to 16, because we want to be sure to include that, because here it shows that those were visions, those were signified,
Mhm.
they weren't literal.
right.
Because here, and in other places, it says no one's ever seen God. But here, it says when Christ comes, in verse 14, in his time he will show who is the blessed and only potentate, speaking here of God, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who only has immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach into, whom no man has seen or can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. Amen. That's repeated in other places in plain language.
Yeah.
No one's ever seen it, and they can't.
Right, and that's why we see him being represented here with these descriptions of just brightness and of light and radiance and beautiful stones and rainbows. These are all things that are speaking to different attributes of God, not necessarily, not his actual appearance. He wasn't. These people who are having these visions aren't seeing this with their eyes, right? Even though it still brings them to their knees, right? Even just seeing the things that are represented, that are like him, is bringing these people to is humbling. It's something that is that is leaving them awestruck, and it's just I think it just goes to show, just emphasize even more the just how awesome God is that even these representations of him can cause this kind of reaction in people. Any other comments that I've missed? We've been reading. I can move it kind of fast, so I don't want to miss anything. So like I was mentioning earlier, in Genesis 9, we read about God's covenant with man and how he gave the rainbow as a sign. And we won't take time to read that right now, but if in Genesis 9, verse 8 through 17, we kind of see how that symbol was used as a sign, as a like representative of the covenant that God made with man, not to destroy them with the flood again. And we know from Hebrews 10:23 that God is faithful in his promises and his covenants that he makes with others. So there's things that we can gain from all of these different visions of what's being shown. Did anybody have any other comments on verses 1 through 3? I think there's lots of lessons in it. Chris will probably have more points to bring out of some of these specific things that we read here. But I kind of wanted us to to look at this from just the kind of approach that we're taking with reading these things and how to interpret them. And so as we look here in going down to verse 4 in our main text, it says, around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their head. And this idea of 24 elders is we see throughout the book of Revelation many times. And I think there's going to be some different ways to look at this. I'd like to get into some of them right now, but we're out of time, so we'll pick that up. But maybe look for some references between now and our next class of things that come in like a number of 24, especially throughout the Old Testament. But I would just search for that, and it makes some interesting discussion in our next class.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
You know, I saw that. You're gonna play the. I don't Mr. P, what's going on? Drive.